Today we're going to be talking about Debussy's work Pagodes, or Pagode as he would call it, from his work Estampes. And we're doing that as part of Queen Mary Student Union's Asian Heritage Month. And I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Seow, herself a brilliant musician and the president of the Queen Mary Music Society. It's lovely to see you again, Alex.
All right. Hi, Paul. Glad to be back for another great music talk.
Exactly. This is a piece that I love myself, and you love it equally.
Yes, I do.
It's one of three pieces from a set Estampes, and there is a sort of an unusual history. But when did you first become familiar with this work?
Well, my piano teacher introduced Estampes to me it as one of the first pieces to look at, kind of the first sets of music to look at after I just done my grade 8 piano exam. As you said, it was a set of three pieces where Debussy was inspired by kind of the sounds and experiences from different countries. And obviously the first piece, Pagodes, it's just felt familiar to me in a way because, you know, as a Malaysian, I would have grown up hearing all the sounds of the gamelan, etc. in primary school, you know, learning about it as, you know, just part of my culture.
You use that word gamelan, which I think many people will understand or know that word. It'll be familiar. But what does gamelan mean?
So it's the name you use for kind of Javanese, I guess, ensembles, much like our Western orchestras here. They'd have consisted of, you know, a few instruments, a singer perhaps. And I guess the sound that people would be most familiar with would be kind of the ringing sounds of the gongs that they used to have. They'd, you know, they'd be sat in rows, and it's almost like a xylophone, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Gongs, yeah.
Yes, they're called gong plays, and they literally put the gongs flat, as opposed to they'd be hung up. Well, they do have gongs that are hanging, the large gongs hanging, but they have wooden structures in which they put the flattened gongs, and they play them with mallets above. Absolutely. Yeah. It's an original sound, isn't it? Familiar only to Indonesia, but gongs are very familiar throughout Asia, aren't they, as instruments?
Yeah, most definitely. I think the tuning as well, because it's not just one big gong hanging there for more percussive effect. It's very much a tuned instrument. So I guess the tuning of it would have been different to our Western scales as well.
Absolutely right. Yes, because there are two particular scales that they use in Indonesia, the Pilog and the Slendra scale. One is a 5-note scale, which is a little bit like the pentatonic scale. The tunings are different, and they're different all over the world. And one is a 7-note scale, which again is different to our 7-note scale. So we have a 7-note scale, which is our major or minor scale, or the pentatonic scale. They are slightly differently tuned, and that which means, for those who are wondering what on earth I'm talking about, it means that the differences between each note are different to the conventional sounds that we are familiar with in the West, in Western classical music. So you felt an immediate affinity with Debussy's work. And then I think you went on to study it more. You went on to find out about the piece, why it was as it was. What did you discover?
Well, I discovered for Pagode in particular, he was inspired by the sounds of literal gamelan. But in the Paris exhibition, what they did was they quite literally shipped a bunch of these musicians from all these Southeast Asian countries and kind of brought them over to Paris to, I guess in the time they thought, you know, we'd be sharing the culture.
Yes, well, of course, we're going back to those dark days of the colonies, aren't we?
Yeah.
Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia, Indochina, was a part of the French colonies. But the Paris exhibition, I mean, the Eiffel Tower is what we remember of the Paris exhibition, because the Eiffel Tower was built fundamentally.
And it remained.
And it remains. It's the only thing that does. But these exhibitions were extraordinary, weren't they? Parts of Paris became like a form of Disneyland, didn't they?
Yeah. The amount of effort they put in, I guess, to all these life-size replicas, it's really amazing. Like, I couldn't imagine kind of going back to Malaysia, for example, and being like, oh, there's the Eiffel Tower.
Yes, and you're quite right about that issue of life-size replicas, because what they did was they built plaster cast life-size structures of buildings, or buildings that resembled or were typical of the architecture that you would find in those countries. I know you knew I was going to do this, but behind me, on the screen behind, is the pagoda that Debussy would have seen in 1889, and it's an impression of a Khmer temple. It's a pagoda. These sorts of stone buildings that they would have had in Cambodia in the times of the Khmer Empire were built as temples, not as pagodas. But that's the unusual thing, isn't it? Do you find it, because Debussy's influenced by the Far East, he's influenced by a building that's Cambodian, in essence. He's influenced by Indonesian music. You're recognizing this coming from Malaysia, but the music of Malaysia is different to the music of China, is different to the music of Indonesia, is different to the art of both these countries. All of these have very specific national qualities. Do you sometimes feel a little bit irritated by the Westerners' view of the East?
Yeah, well, that's a very heavy question, Paul. I think when I think about Debussy's time, I can kind of understand why it would have been such an intriguing topic for him, such an inspiration, because these would have been sounds and sights that he'd never seen before. And, he probably couldn't have afforded, or might not have wanted to, take a ship all the way to Southeast Asia to experience these things for himself. So in a way, he was sort of just appreciating and taking inspiration from stories that had been told by others. Though I think it does get more difficult, as the centuries go by, as time goes on, to say how much of it is appreciation and how much of it is appropriation, and where people could have done educating themselves more.
Well, I think you're quite right there, because at that time it would have been, there were people who went out to Indonesia and out to Indochina, etc., traders, etc., and restorers. And the Khmer buildings were fundamentally all restored by the French. We have a huge amount to thank the French for, and the School of the Extreme Orient, which oversaw all the restoration of Angkor, which was not in ruins, but it was really crumbling. It had been left abandoned. So there were huge bonuses. But you're quite right. People could not fly to these countries. Just
Exactly.
It was a boat ride, and that was a long journey. In Debussy's case, he wanted, I think, to escape France. He wanted to escape the traditions of the music of the West, which had become very formalized, and that route to the Far East offered a form of escape. There's a very different musical structure, isn't there, to the music of the Eastern world as opposed to the music of the West. Would you dare to give us a sort of brief glimpse as to what those fundamental differences are?
Falling back on my very spotty knowledge of music history, I think Western music probably developed a lot of structure and kind of organization in how the music was written, especially by the time Debussy would have been around. While for Eastern music, even now when I think of Eastern music, I think of the village folk tunes that they still play during celebrations. like our Muslim celebrations, our Chinese celebrations, Indian celebrations. It's still folk music, things that are still passed down orally, you know, not really notated down in the classical sense as we would know it, like, you know, a kind of do, re, mi sort of system.
Yes, absolutely. Everything is handed down by the oral tradition as opposed to that very exactly notated system that's been
Yeah.
in the West. Quite right. This petite piece has a particular sound quality, which is designed to resemble the sound of gongs. Is that right?
Yes, it does. So I guess in use of the pentatonic scale, very prevalent, lots of black keys for me to have missed when I was learning this piece. And then like also lots of pedal notes. It's quite interesting to have learned how to achieve that effect. I remember there was a section where you'd have one pedal note just throughout, I think, a page or two of this a theme floating up above.
You're absolutely right, because this is a real challenge for pianists. The piano is not a sustaining instrument. You hit the note and it dies. If you hit
Indeed,
the gong,
yes.
I mean, it will die eventually, but it's going to last, it's going to vibrate for longer.
Yeah.
Those large gongs, which Debussy's trying to imitate with those pedal notes, which would ring on, if you put your foot on what we call the sustaining pedal, then everything rings on, doesn't it? Uh, and,
Exactly.
and so it becomes it sounds as if you're playing the piano in a bar. So you have to very skillfully try to deceive the ear, don't you, as the pianist?
Yeah, because ultimately that piece was just imitating an entire orchestra of gongs, while in an original orchestra, you know, each person would have the option to kind of mute this one, let that one carry on for longer. While for piano, it's just you and one instrument.
Yes.
So it was quite fun to translate that over, I think.
Now, that must suggest that Debussy took a very detailed interest when he heard the Javanese gamelan it was that came to quite right to Paris in 1889. And there's a difference between the Javanese and the Balinese gamelan. The Javanese is much more stately and measured in speed. The Balinese gamelan is much more flighty. They often use much more vigorous, fast tempos. Smaller island. I don't know why that is, but they do. There's a much more leisurely approach to the Javanese. But he became so. It is such a successful recreation. He must have been
It
taking very
is.
great care listening to the music and absorbing it, maybe even making sketches of what he heard. So when we return to this work, Pagodes, or Pagode, I should call it, um, it it really made a massive impact, didn't it? It's very
Yes.
hard to explain the level of impact, but in a way, this single piece helped change the direction of music throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, I guess I may be wrong in saying this, but because you know Debussy is one of those we now consider an impressionist sort of composer, so I guess kind of riding along the momentum of you know really changing the style in which composers were writing music in the first place, kind of adding a whole new sound world wouldn't have been unexpected almost. It was just part of the discovery, the development of music, which I really enjoy.
It was really the first, well, not the first, but one of the real key points in the internationalization of music. What's interesting, of course, is that Debussy was so inspired by the East. Debussy's music so inspired Olivier Messiaen. Olivier Messiaen became even more interested in the music of the East, of India, of the Far East, as well as the Indian subcontinent and that. And then many Far Eastern composers decided that they wanted to go and study with Messiaen because of his interest.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And then that has in turn influenced their own way of writing. So when I was talking with Roy about Chigang Chen, who studied with Messiaen,
Yeah.
there's a Western quality to that music, but it is a genuine fusion of East and West, which is very
Yes.
faithful, isn't it? It's not done in a way in which we feel it's trite. It's very sincere and actually becomes very beautiful as a result. And that all
Yeah.
stems from Debussy, doesn't it? From this work.
Yes, when you think about it, when you put it that way, that's exactly it. Um, yeah, I think it's very interesting, and it's amazing how we have the opportunities now to, even for me myself, to be in this country and have a Western education. And it's so amazing how some composers are able to absorb, not just pick the stereotypes from each type of music, but really absorb the compositional styles and the sounds from all over the world and just produce one kind of mashup of them all, I guess. Mashup sounds a bit too brash,
No,
but
but I know exactly what you mean.
yes.
I would totally agree. But it does require you to become very, very familiar and sincerely familiar with that other culture. Well, Alex, it's been lovely talking to you about this particular work. I'm so pleased that we raised this piece in conversation between us because it really is such an important work. And it sums up, if we're talking about Asian heritage in the Western world, it sums up the way
Yeah,
music changed as a direction.
yes, it does. It's just beyond societal norms and whatnot.
Absolutely.
Um,
It's lovely to be joined by you, Alex.
yeah, thank you. It's been great to be able to talk about this as well as, as a Malaysian, having learnt about, kind of growing up a bit of Asian culture and then growing up in the Western world. It's nice to know how these things work.